This is the Metamorphosis Moment, a podcast from Noetic Consultants. We are researchers, strategists, trainers, and coaches obsessed with how change actually sticks. On our show, we have candid discussions with leaders who are embracing change, and we work to uncover what they're doing to help others achieve similar success. Just like with our clients, we bring our Noetic secret sauce to each conversation. We dig into the messy middle, finding human behavior and leadership factors that are making a difference and sharing practical guidance that you can use in the moments that matter most. I'm your host, Nancie McDonnell Dougherty. Let's fly. Most companies say they're customer-centric, or at least that they're striving to be. But truly operationalizing your company to serve your customer on their terms, from the beginning of their journey all the way through, takes more than surveys, dashboards, or data to truly pull it off. It requires listening, asking better questions, and turning feedback into action at every step. And it requires someone in a position to see across the ecosystem and ensure that the journey is cared for from end to end. Our guest today sits in that seat and believes that the strongest customer relationships are built intentionally over time, one conversation at a time. Today I'm joined by Kelly Yazdani, Chief Customer Officer at Voltus. After leading marketing for years, Kelly stepped into a newly created role designed to unify the entire customer journey from first impression to long-term partnership. Along the way, she has discovered that the closer you get to your customers, the better every part of your business becomes. In our conversation today, we explore why great leaders listen before they lead, the surprising power of being a generalist, and how putting the customer at the center can transform not only your marketing, but your entire organization. Let's get started. Kelly, welcome. This is going to be an electric conversation. Somebody did there. Very bad pun.
Love it.
But since we'll talk about Voltus, I'm sure it's going to be electric in general. I'm super excited to dig in with you, especially because you have made this really interesting evolution at Voltus, and it really will, I think, help our listeners understand deep customer experience, which thinking about the customer journey is just such a challenge for every organization. It's so hard to hit all those touch points. So I know we'll get into that as we talk. But let's start in the place of like your background prior to your life at Voltus, and then we'll dig into your current role.
Yeah, Nancy, that's a great place to start. So I think we'll be talking a little bit more about this idea of like being a generalist versus a specialist, but I definitely consider myself a generalist, and my career has taken sort of a really interesting path as I have kind of always tried to look for the next great opportunity versus following a very specific path in my career. So I actually studied chemistry at Dartmouth. There was a period of time where I thought I was going to be a medical doctor because at the time it was sort of like, you're good at science and you're good with people. The combination of those things means you should go into medicine. But then as I went down that path and did things like volunteer at hospitals and expose myself to things like giving people shots, I was like, this is not the path for me. So then it was sort of like, what do I do with this very analytical and scientific mind that I had? And I actually ended up going into energy trading straight out of college. So that happened a little bit by happenstance. I went through the corporate recruiting process my fall of my senior year at Dartmouth and sort of landed upon this job. But that was my first exposure to the energy industry. And it was a really exciting time, and it was really sort of uncharted territory at the time. So
For sure.
my first exposure to that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I relate deeply to the idea of like just the very human part of the suffering. Like, I'm so grateful that there are people who do that for a living, but it would not be for me. Like, for me to walk down the corridors of a hospital is hard. I do it, but it's not where I think I could live my career. Okay. So energy early on, energy was on your radar by the time you were a senior in college. So then what happened?
Yeah, so then I actually eventually stepped away from energy trading to start my family. So I had kids in my 20s, which is kind of atypical this day and age. And I stepped away for a few years in order to focus on them. And then I actually re-entered the workforce and started getting involved with a series of small startups. So I helped start a canine dental product line with one of my really good friends who's a human dentist, but had a really interesting idea of how to care for dogs' teeth. And that could be a whole nother conversation.
Good.
I also worked with a different startup that was focused on human cooling. So they made this wearable water bottle that could be used by military, law enforcement, industrial workers in order to keep their bodies cool in these really high stress environments. So those were both really interesting opportunities. And I really fell in love with helping grow businesses and go to market. And how do you bring a product to market? How do you meet the needs of your customers? And how do you remain scrappy and gritty and innovative in order to grow a business? Following those opportunities, I then came across Voltus.
Yeah. And I mean, what better place to learn how to be a really strong generalist than in a small company, particularly a startup, where you inevitably you have to wear a lot of hats and you have to figure things out. You just have to stay really curious. I know you and I have talked in the past that in my book about how senior marketers excel, we talk a lot about the importance of being a generalist, and it gets a bad rap because a lot of people think, well, if you're generally good at everything or claiming to be generally good at everything, then you're not really good at anything. But really being a strong generalist means knowing a lot about a lot. It doesn't mean knowing a little about a lot. And I know that you've also said, as we move into talking about Voltus, that the people on your team also you consider to be strong generalists. I sometimes call people like all around athletes. Like they could actually do a triathlon instead of just doing a marathon kind of a thing. So tell our listeners a bit who aren't familiar with Voltus some context around what the business does.
Yeah, absolutely. Voltus aggregates distributed energy resources at large commercial and industrial facilities like manufacturers, data centers, hospitals, universities, as well as residential customers into what's called virtual power plants. So we then bring those resources to wholesale energy markets so that grid operators can take load off the electric grid during times of stress. The energy resources that we aggregate are varied. It's not just the curtailable load that facilities have. It can also be things like behind the meter batteries. And what's interesting about distributed energy resources and virtual power plants is they've entered mainstream a little bit more because the electric grid is under enormous pressure. So we're all very aware. We look at our electricity bills, we see them rising. Load is growing faster than new supply can come online. So our customers are really part of the solution. Like they have flexibility on how and when they use their energy, and we turn that into a revenue stream for them, which makes the electric grid more reliable for everyone.
And so give us an example of who the buyer would be. Let's say you were talking about a hospital, or let's say you were talking about a higher education institution. Who is that buyer and how do they know that they want to invest in this area?
Let me start by also saying, like, what I just said may sound complex, but the pitch to our customers is simple. It's basically you're already managing your energy costs. We can help you get paid for the flexibility you already have in the way you use energy at your facility. So in terms of personas, like a lot of times we're talking to corporate energy managers, we are talking to the vice president of facilities and operations. Sometimes we're even talking to the financial people, so a CFO, a head of finance, because they are looking for ways to optimize the way that they're operating internally and are looking for new revenue streams, particularly at a time when energy costs are
rising.
Are rising.
Yeah. And of course we are further taxing the grid, particularly now as we have AI. It's really making it exponentially more. We have worked with a renewable energy company, and one of the things that the CEO would often say is we are both doing good and doing good for business, because you are enabling that savings. And I'm not going to say it's like, oh, it's easy for you to sell what you're selling, but it really is a simple value proposition that they can get their minds around,
Yeah,
which is once they understand it.
Yeah, and I think what's also interesting is we are not selling a physical product, right? We are selling the opportunity to create a new revenue stream. So the conversation is a little bit different than what you would have if you were selling explicitly a software service or something of that nature. We are really looking for partnerships where our customers are willing to optimize their energy usage based on the needs of the grid and create a new revenue stream from that.
Yeah, awesome. So tell us a little bit about your roles there, and most particularly interested to hear, and I'm sure the people listening, about being head of marketing and now moving into this chief customer officer role. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I moved into the chief customer officer role. I think November is when I officially made the transition, and it was a new role. So Voltus created it to unify the customer experience end to end, and I was asked to step into it. I think that context matters because it really shaped how I approached the role from day one. So, in our business, sales has historically owned the customer relationship from close through ongoing account management. So, as chief marketing officer, which is the role I was in immediately prior to this chief customer officer role, I not only led marketing, but also inside sales and sales operations. So, I had built a really strong relationship with the sales org and a really deep understanding of where the seams were in the customer experience. So, Voltus saw that I was well positioned to take on the operational aspects of the customer journey and then work closely with sales to make sure that that experience was truly unified.
Yeah. So what are you finding to be, now that you're in the seat, and I realize it's not been all that long,
Yeah.
in a year, but what are you finding to be really great? And then what are you finding to be challenging? It's never exactly what we think.
Yeah, exactly. It is never exactly what we think. And then as you dig in, you find more, right? So you have this idea and then you start doing the work and that idea evolves. I think some of the things that I am more empowered to do is I can now really fully act on what I hear from customers, not just report it upward. So as CMO, I could surface a problem, but I didn't necessarily have all of the tools to solve the problem. And now as CCO, I can own that fix. The other thing that I'm really excited about is I have direct influence over how we structure account management, how we triage customer feedback, and then how we close the loop now. And
Yeah.
that's just a really fun environment to play in and figure out how do we opt those things in order to best meet the needs of our
Yeah. Can you
customers.
give us an example in that realm of maybe something where you got customer feedback and then you were able to act on it to close that loop in a good way?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the big initiatives that I've started in this role is something I'm calling the customer listening tour. So, I basically segmented our customer base. I said, who are our customers who are contributing most to our bottom line, right? And let me really sit down and dig in with them and understand, what is it like to be a Voltus customer? Are there pain points? What are the things that are working? In a lot of cases, some of these customers worked with some of our competitors previously. So how do we stack up? And we do a lot of this research and intelligence through other mechanisms within the business, but this was meant to really dig in and for these customers to feel like they had a direct line to our executive team.
One of the things I hear a lot of people struggle with is getting that feedback. Can I ask, like, what mechanism do you use to ensure? Because when people do surveying and such, a lot of times they just get low response rates.
Yeah. I mean, I found that now this is very human intensive, right? But I found that segmenting and thinking about who are the customers that we want to get deeper feedback from and really spending the time to then invest human resources in getting that feedback, you get a level of depth that you do not get from a survey,
Yeah, by
right?
making it very high touch. Yeah. So basically you're talking about like one-on-one conversations.
Now, that's not the only mechanism. We did a really extensive annual customer feedback survey in the fall. We moved away from doing sort of just like a traditional NPS, and we decided we're going to go deep on some very particular areas and really invest resources and multiple email sends and really being deliberate about the way we structured the survey. And we got a lot of really tremendous feedback from that as well that really influenced our
Gotcha.
product
Yeah.
roadmap. So we've just started to be very
Yeah, because
intentional.
it's definitely a tricky thing. And I think part of it is just the human nature of people are busy. And so taking the time to give feedback, but they're generally happy, they don't take the time.
Yeah,
And so then it can also lead to skewed results. So I do think that though time intensive, the highly human touch way is the best way. And it also gets you the nuance,
yeah,
but not to be replaced with quantitative data.
of
Okay, so
course.
back to your example.
Yeah, so the example was I started this customer listening tour. I sat down with a specific group of customers one on one. I had a certain list of questions that I would run through, um, with some variation, obviously, because there's customer context. But there was some consistent feedback we were getting on our platform and how easy or hard it was to extract certain financial information from the platform. So, this is feedback we had sort of heard in various forms, but it became like this really consistent theme, but also a fairly straightforward fix. So, it was interesting that this theme emerged. And now, in my role, I'm working much more closely with our product team. So, immediately I was able to sit down with the product team and say, okay, here are the few things we're hearing. I actually think the fix here is relatively simple for these customers. Let's work together and put our heads together and solve this problem quickly. Builds incredible credibility with the customer, right? Because they're like, wait, I just asked for this thing and now
And
you're
now you're
solving
able
it, right? It's tremendous. And it's not that that feedback didn't exist before, but there was like a level of urgency that came because we were doing this tour. We were sitting down with the customers. We were trying to follow through on those commitments quickly. That really became an impetus for sort of like quick innovation. So it's been a really exciting process to be a part of because we've been able to make some really high impact changes pretty
yeah.
quickly.
And then are you looping back with those customers and helping them know we heard this thematically and we're addressing it and here's how we're doing it?
Yes, absolutely. So that feedback loop is a super important part of the process because, again, by definition, the customers that I'm sitting down with are very important to our business, right? So, like, it's about feedback and incorporating that feedback, but it's also about retaining those customers and strengthening those
Yeah.
relationships over
Yeah.
time.
I mean, I think it sounds so basic, but I will say I think a lot of companies miss this step of telling their customer what they're doing to improve their products and services based upon customer feedback. Like if you think about the times that you see a company speaking directly to their customer and saying, "We heard you," oftentimes it's off the back of a big issue, like some
Yes.
major, mistake, right? Where people were like up in arms. But those little things of like, hey, we heard you wanted this and here's this. Hey, we heard you on this and we
Yep.
tweaked this goes a super long way because people really want to be heard. And I think that's something that oftentimes we can miss because we're on the inside looking out as
Yep.
opposed to thinking from the shoes. So if you're thinking then with your marketing hat on, because you still have your marketing hat, right?
Yep.
You're not you added this role. It wasn't like a total, you know,
Yep.
not this, now this, but really the two together, and that's the power of it. Is there any way in which you're approaching your messaging or your marketing strategy differently now that you have this line of sight and agency, I'll say, within the customer experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So as CMO, I was always trying to represent the customer, right? That's a critical
Of course.
foundational concept in marketing. But I was often doing it from the outside in, and now it feels like I'm doing it from the inside out. I'm now in direct conversations with customers constantly. And it's not like I didn't talk to customers before, but now it feels like I'm really
Yeah.
entrenched and embedded by nature of my role. And that really starts to change what you emphasize and how. So I can give a concrete example of this. So our customers participate in these programs with Voltus largely because it creates a new revenue stream for their business. The economic buyer, like the person making the initial enrollment decision, is actually often very different from the operators who actually have to execute participation.
Okay.
So we had some financial language in some of our communications that some of our communications that were actually oriented towards operators, and it just wasn't landing.
It
So
wasn't like
I
maybe in the human speak of what would make sense to them. Yeah.
right. So as I became much more embedded with customers, I realized, okay, we're actually not nailing personas when it comes to certain sets of communications. So we then shifted the framing for those particular communications around operational simplicity. So things like, we handle the hard parts so you don't have to.
Mm.
And the response was completely different. So I just can't overemphasize, even when you think you are customer oriented, pushing yourself to be even more customer oriented, be more embedded with your customers. Like it just continues to open up new
Yeah.
perspectives that can have a huge impact on the
Yeah.
organization.
I do want to pause on that. I think you're making a fantastic point, whether someone is working in a marketing capacity, in a customer experience capacity, or across the both, and frankly, anyone in any function. How
Yes,
are you getting close to your customer and staying close to your customer? It is really not anybody's fault that like we exist inside the walls of the given company within
sure.
which we work, and we have a tendency, I just think of it as like this gravitational pull. We have this tendency to be like immersed in our work, and we have our priorities and we're trying to get things done, but in service to someone. And
Yep.
how is that someone responding to us? And it's just an easy thing to lose sight of. And there's so many ways one can do it now. Obviously, if you have a product that is in B2C and you have a retail presence, you can literally go walk the aisles, right?
Yes.
And see your customer in their habitat. But no matter what kind of customer you have, there are ways. And some of those ways are quite easy to do. Do you have a presence, any kind of forum where customers are giving feedback? Like,
Yep.
what are customers saying about you online? I mean, these things are readily available and they can be very illuminating what people are choosing to say. Now, the human condition is that people are going to speak up more often when there's an issue. So you don't want to necessarily get like an overly negative view, but also there's always things to improve. So just really encourage that customer centricity wherever you can get it.
Yeah, and listen, the scope is wide, right? And resources are precious. So we've had to make really deliberate choices about what to systematize versus what to handle personally. But on the point you were just making, there's also a cultural shift that's required. So we have been really working on getting the whole company to see customer feedback as a shared asset, not just a customer success or a sales responsibility, right? Because our sales team and our customer success team actually very inherently understand the needs of our customers because of the level of constant communication. So, one of the other things we did is we stood up a customer intel Slack channel. So, Slack is our primary method of internal
Mhm.
communication. We're a virtual company, and it has a very structured template for field, like an input template for field intelligence. So the goal was really to make it easy for anyone, sales, operations, product, to contribute what they're hearing. So it doesn't just live in someone's head, but it starts to get socialized throughout the organization. So an engineer who's sitting at their desk building something actually has that perspective of the customer as
Yeah.
well. And it's a work in progress, but we're seeing it really start to influence sort of like how people are sharing information and how that information is spreading through the organization.
Yeah, so that's just a great example of like a a tactical change, right? To try to really push toward that culture of overall, like everybody's job is to be close to that customer. I wonder, because I do think this is such a difficult space. We hear it all the time of the end to end of that customer experience because in many ways, so many different people are touching it. And in a lot of organizations, there are key pieces of it you absolutely don't control. And
Yeah.
there's nothing you can do to control those pieces. So understanding that there's a lot of messiness in there.
Yes.
Are there other things that you would recommend to help mitigate on that fragmentation, the siloedness, if that's a word, and also getting people across the organization to really be thinking about the full customer experience? I think the Slack example is a great example.
Yeah. So again, I transitioned to this role in, I think it was November. I keep saying that, but I think that's right. From when I transitioned to the holidays, I spent talking to every member of my new team. I spent significant one-on-one time with my new leaders, and we really got intentional about what is the mission and vision of this organization, and what are some of the important sound bites that we can give to the team in order to empower them to drive this mission and vision forward. One of the things I kept coming back to was expectations equal reality. So I said, customer dissatisfaction lives in a world where expectations don't meet reality. Not to say reality twice, but the reality is that reality changes. The reality of the reality, we're going to get really meta here. Reality changes, right? Especially in an industry like ours, where we're living in the world of energy markets. Pricing changes, dynamics changes, constantly changing. What that means is we have a responsibility to update or bring our customers along so that their expectations evolve as reality evolves. So this became this slide where it literally was like expectations equal reality that I just started presenting and talking about this concept in so many different forums within the organization. Not just the customer org, but also our company all hands, our sales team all hands. Like I literally went on this little tour where I really started sharing the vision of this. And I think giving people little things like that that they can remember so that they know, okay, when I'm touching a customer interaction, am I helping keep this equation intact? Or if reality is changing, am I then working to update expectations? Am I looking at the systems and processes that I'm building and saying, how does that fit into this equation? To me, at least, that has built a lot of unity of vision around what we're trying to do. And it has helped the entire organization to feel like they're part of that process.
Yeah, Kelly, I really appreciate what you're saying from a couple of really important angles. Firstly, you went around and listened. And as much as that may sound like such a basic thing to do, it's so important when a leader is in a new role to really have that time. When people feel heard from the jump, they are far more likely to align with where you're going, even if where you go isn't 100% what they would have expected or what they would have hoped for. So the listening up front is critical. And then the fact that you socialized around in a high touch way, getting people to make that application directly to their role. People need to hear things different ways several times to really have it drop in. And that applicability back to their own role is what is really critical, because it's easy for people to assume, well, that's like a marketing thing, or that's a customer experience thing, that's a product thing, that's a tech thing, that doesn't really affect me. And so the more we make it relevant literally to the what's in it for me and what do I need to do with this. And I
Yep.
think it sounds like you did a beautiful job in that whole realm.
Thank you.
So I want to talk a little bit more about this notion of being a generalist, because I do think it's such a powerful thing. It's definitely not everybody's path. There's certainly a place for specialists, but particularly in marketing and when you're talking about the full realm of customer experience, it's so critical. What have you learned about being the power behind being that generalist, or what we've called like the Swiss Army knife,
Yeah.
where you're able to pivot and use different skills and at different times. Can you share some examples of like how you've learned it and how you use it?
Sure. So I think a generalist's superpower is pattern recognition across domains, right? So
Agree.
seeing enough different problems in enough different contexts, you start to recognize the underlying shape of a challenge, even when the surface might look a little bit different. So it's interesting. The dog dental startup taught me more about customer acquisition and operational scrappiness than almost anything else, right? Energy trading taught me to think in systems and probabilities. None of it was wasted, even though it wasn't this very traditional linear career path. I think sometimes the risk of being a generalist is you can feel like an imposter
Mhm.
in rooms full of specialists, right?
Yes.
You can start to
Yes.
be like, I don't know 150% about this one specific topic. I know 80% about 100 different topics, right?
Yes.
So the reframe that really worked for me or has worked for me is I'm not here to always be the deepest expert. I'm really here to connect the dot between experts. And like, I just feel very comfortable. Over time, I've become really comfortable living in that space, and realizing that there's a lot of value in being the connector within an
Yeah, being
organization.
the connector. Yeah, I think being the connector is critical because we need connectors. Being able to see patterns and taking that learning and applying it elsewhere is also critical. And the resourcefulness also that I think comes with people really being intent on understanding that there's not really a set path here, but I have enough skills here to figure out how to make a path. And in particular, what is coming to my mind too, and I think it's just very relevant to so many marketers who may be our listeners today, there's a lot of people who are seeking to make a change in their careers. Perhaps they were in one industry for a long time and that industry is now really disrupted and it's harder to get a role, and or they may be craving a change. And sometimes it's a combination of the both. Really looking at what are those thematic skills that you have learned over time, the way, you're able to pull those from those specific experiences that you had. Those situational learnings are very applicable. And there certainly are industries where people will just say, we have to have someone who's already a retail expert, or we have to have someone who's a fill in the blank.
Right.
But I hear so many senior leaders lamenting about having team members who aren't resourceful,
Mm,
who don't know how to figure things out. They want to have a set path. And so that skill set, I believe, is underrated. And when people have it in the team, it is incredibly powerful. So I wonder, what advice do you have for people who are leading generalists? Because there is some imposter syndrome. There's definitely that need to have a certain amount of subject matter expertise, or at least know where to seek it. How do you think folks like that can tap into their full potential?
Yeah, and I don't want to diminish the importance of subject matter expertise too, because I think even if you consider yourself a generalist, you don't just sit there and not try to deepen your understanding of a particular subject, right? There is
Right.
a level of expertise that is
Yes.
required in order to advance within an organization. I just think those generalist skills can be a huge asset. In terms of managing generalists, I think it's really important to give people clear lanes, right? And it's not because generalists need to be constrained, but without clarity on priorities, a generalist will try to do everything and often burn themselves out, right? I also try to celebrate cross-functional contributions explicitly. So when someone on my team uses their background in an unexpected way to solve a problem, I try to name it out loud. So
Yeah.
that reinforces that breadth is a feature and not a liability. And then the last thing is I do watch for shiny object syndrome. So in myself and in them, right? The antidote to that is a really strong strategic filter. So we have to ask ourselves, does this serve the customer? Does this move the needle on our core metrics? And if you can't answer yes, then that particular initiative gets deprioritized.
Yeah, and you mentioned shiny objects and you mentioned metrics, and I want to touch on each of those. You
Right.
and I have talked about that you have a bit of a superpower in taking what is a business goal that may have a stubborn metric that's, it needs to be unlocked, and figuring out the path. I think that's a wonderful example of like a great generalist muscle. Like, I'm going to dig into this particular dilemma. Can you give us an example of how you've done that? Like, how do you go about it?
So this was when I was in a marketing role. Although again, when I was in a marketing role, I was still sort of a generalist, right? Like my title was marketing, but I owned marketing, I owned sales operations, I owned our inside sales team. So I was literally owning kind of like all top of the funnel and
Mhm.
sales enablement. And then eventually customer success came under my umbrella as well. But we were really trying to move the needle on win rate. So because we knew if we could move the needle and close more of our pipeline, that was our fastest path to even more accelerated growth. And I will note that our win rate wasn't bad. It's just we recognize we want to improve it even more. So what we did is we kind of like, without getting into all the details, we made a list. We sat down as a cross-functional team and we said, who are all the teams and what are all of the different ways we can influence this metric? And we got really, really specific because we knew it wasn't going to be one team and one plan of action. We knew it was going to involve sales training. We knew it was going to involve marketing and messaging. We knew it was going to involve better just like sales team. We knew it was going to actually involve retaining the team we currently have, because as a sales team member becomes more tenured, their win rate actually naturally improves. So then that required working with the people organization, right? So we sat down and we said, what are all of these different factors? How can we make sure each team that touches these different factors has a clear vision of what we're trying to accomplish and initiatives to drive that forward? And then we sort of set out on this path to do it. So again, I think it requires a lot of human skills.
Yeah. And that's very multifaceted, right? I mean, you really looked at the full ecosystem of what it was going to take to improve that metric. And the truth is that it might have been 70% of this thing and 20% of this thing, but you looked at the full package of what it would take. And I think it goes back to just starting with the generalist thinking, and really you thought through like the end-to-end customer experience of what it takes to win.
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. And a piece of advice I would just give to people very broadly in their career is like one of the most important skills we can have is the ability to pull stakeholders together and drive them toward a goal, right? And that's a human skill that cannot be underscored, especially as we move to an age of increased automation and increased
Yes.
computer. Like that human skill of influence and collaboration and communication, I think has never been more important.
Couldn't agree more. And it's becoming more important now as we're moving into more automation and we're moving into less hands-on and less human to human. I could see where people could think it would matter less. It actually is getting increasingly documented that it matters more. And it doesn't happen naturally. And that's just part of the human condition, particularly in business, because we're coming at it from different functions
Yep.
that have different priorities that all need to roll up to one overall set of goals. But it's easy for things to just devolve without that overt effort. We spend a ton of time in our consulting practice working on alignment. And one of the critical ways in which we do it is the early listening. If people feel heard from the beginning, they won't come later and say, how come this? How come that? Because they were in the know from the beginning. It is more work. I mean, there's no question it takes more time.
Yep.
And it is more work, and it's kind of messy work at times. It's not always linear, but it's critical. And if you don't do it, you're not going to get where you're trying to go, because people are just, their hearts and minds are not on board. And I did, before we wrap, I do want to go back to the shiny object. One of the One of the dilemmas that we often see is shiny objectness coming from senior leadership. So, how do you keep yourself honest on the shiny objects, or if or when shiny objects are coming at you from your senior leadership, and how you determine when it's just shiny or when it's something that is worth investing time and effort into?
Well, first of all, I think setting goals and metrics early on and really clearly communicating about what the priorities are. Like, here are the metrics we're trying to move the needle on. Here are the initiatives that are going to help. And FYI, everyone, these are the things we're really going to be focusing on. And if we need to add more to the plate, we need to kind of reshuffle things. So I think this is where, again, early, frequent communication becomes so critical and so important. I don't think you can ever really over communicate. That's my personal philosophy, because every time you even reinforce something you've already said, it just strengthens alignment. But I try to keep a short list of what we're actually trying to accomplish in a given quarter. So again, when something new comes in, and something always comes in, that's just the nature.
Yeah.
Again, I ask, does this displace something on the list, or does it simply not make the list?
Yeah.
And then I loop back to the stakeholders who are asking for the new thing to make sure they understand and they're on board.
Yeah.
So I think being a generalist actually helps here, kind of counterintuitively, because I've chased enough shiny objects over the years to recognize which ones are actually worth it. So again, this goes back to that whole concept of pattern
Yeah,
recognition.
absolutely. And I want to put a fine point too on, because there's so many people who are having roles added to their plate and or responsibilities added to their plate. And many people out there are feeling very overwhelmed with their workloads. So what we often advise, particularly in our coaching practice, is, as you just described, look at your priorities against the goals and the metrics that have been set. And when new things come in that are added to your plate, you don't just keep adding, but
Yeah.
you look and you say, okay, if this is going to become a new priority, then what moves off?
Yep.
And then also using the goals and the metrics as a filtering for whether or not a thing should get attention. Like, just because something is a good idea doesn't mean that it's a good idea
Right.
right now.
Right.
It
Exactly.
may be a good idea next quarter. It may be a good idea next year. It might be a good idea that's just not on strategy. So I
Yep.
think that's a critical component, because there's a lot of stress going on out there around people feeling like, how am I possibly going to get all of this done? And the answer is, you're not. You need to figure out which pieces really should get done.
Absolutely.
So I love the fact that you have evolved into this role where you are so close to that customer. I want to think about, in your leadership, as you've grown over the years from startups and even from your early on medical journey and into energy now, and all the things you've learned along the way, is there some sort of a limiting belief you used to have that you set aside, that you feel like makes you a stronger leader with everything that you have done and experienced?
Yeah, I think I am a recovering perfectionist. I know a lot of people say that,
Same.
it's just the reality of it. So for a really long time, my default was, I need to know exactly how I'm going to do the thing before I commit to doing it. So
Mm,
I wanted that full picture before I took the first step. I can still sometimes get caught in it, right? When this new role was pitched to me, I was like, oh my gosh, like, how am I going to do it? Right. There was that moment of like, I want to figure out the roadmap before I say yes. And I kind of have to catch myself in that thinking. The problem with that mindset is it's paralyzing, because the
yes.
honest answer is nobody knows how to do the thing before they do the thing. Like, that's just the reality. That's not a flaw in the plan. That's just how hard things work. You learn by doing. So it's interesting, because what changed it for me actually wasn't a leadership book or a particular mentor. It was actually becoming a mother. So, you cannot wait until you feel ready, right? You cannot plan your way into confidence. You have to just show up and figure it out very imperfectly over and over again in real time. And I think being responsible for human life and also the desire that I have for my children to live big, audacious lives that are unencumbered by fear actually really rewired something in me. So now when I feel that hesitation, sort of the I'm not ready voice, I really try to recognize it for what it is. It's not wisdom, it's just really fear wearing a very reasonable sounding costume. And I think once you take the first step, the flywheel starts turning and you're actually 90% of the way there.
Yeah,
So,
I love that. And I love that you learned it from becoming a mom
yeah,
because, you don't know what child you're going to get. And so even if
right.
you had read all the things, and, I think today, actually, in parenthood, social media will serve you A and then B and then C. I mean, there's no lack of advice out there of do it this way, do it that way.
Absolutely.
Um, and just this idea that like it's because it's hard and unexpected that you just have to start and then figure it out as best you can. The other thing that has helped me with perfection is knowing that perfection is actually not a real thing. There's like no such thing as perfect.
Yep.
And so if I'm chasing perfection, I am wasting my time and
Yeah.
I like to be efficient. So I often find that motivating too. But I really appreciate sharing that. I think many, many people have that limiting belief and may not even realize they have it in there, but
Yeah.
it just creates a certain hesitation. And at the end of the day, it's really about one's relationship with fear and realizing when you're in fear and saying to fear, like, I feel you and I'm going to move forward anyway.
Yep.
Yeah,
Beautifully
Kelly,
said.
I so appreciate your taking the time. And I particularly appreciate the tangibility of the way you're going about the end-to-end customer experience. I also appreciate your openness in some of the behind the scene dynamics of like what it really takes to get alignment done. I think you have a very thoughtful leadership approach, and I highly appreciate your generalist attitude and acumen. Thank you so much for joining us
Thank you,
today.
Nancy. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Metamorphosis Moment, a podcast from Noetic Consultants. If this episode made you think about what's next for your team or about a challenge you're currently facing, we'd love to hear from you. We often help leaders think through complex issues to realize the change they seek. Until next time, trust the transformation and make it stick.